Greetings. Welcome to Saturday Sunday School, a not ordinary Bible study. We are pleased to have in-person, socially distanced participants as well as online participants. Our goal is to post a video each week by Saturday before the Sunday session on the selected text in Adult Bible Studies from Cokesbury. This study is related to Sunday, November 1st, 2020. For the next 4 sessions, we will consider where worship takes place in the Scriptures. Improvised altars, synagogues, church, and at the throne of God. This session is Sacred Spaces. To make the most of your study related to today's passage, I encourage you to read from the Old Testament book of Genesis, chapters 8, 12, and 28. At the conclusion of our consideration, I will offer some questions for your contemplation. They can also serve as a guide for discussion with family and friends. Today, we have 3 separate passages from the book of Genesis. The title Genesis is based on the Greek verb meaning to begin to be. It is translated from Hebrew Bereshit, meaning in a beginning. That is where we find the book in the Bible, at the beginning, the first book. It is about Creator God and the early stories of God's chosen people's understanding of their relationship history with God. Chapter 8 concludes the biblical story of a great flood. It is followed by the account of God establishing a covenant with the flood story protagonist Noah. Chapter 12 opens with God calling Abram and serves as a shift in the biblical text. As Bible scholar E.A. Spicer notes, it shifts from episodes in the prehistory of the broader human family to an integral history of a particular group, commencing with one individual. Thus, it is the beginning of the Abrahamic covenant with God. And it extends gradually to his family, then to a people, and still later to a nation. Now this passage is followed by Abram's journey for survival to live as an immigrant in Egypt. Chapter 28 opens with the story of Isaac instructing Jacob on choosing a wife, the first step in establishing a new generation within the covenant relationship with God. Our passage is followed by the account of Jacob on his eastward journey, meeting Rachel, who would become his wife. Let's take a look at our first passage, reading from the New Revised Standard Version, Genesis 8, 20 through 22. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and took of every clean animal and of every clean bird, and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And when the Lord smelled the pleasing odor, the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of humankind, for the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth, nor will I ever again destroy every living creature as I have done. As long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. The word of the Lord. Noah, his family, and an assortment of domestic and wild animals have survived the flood. The dry land has returned, and the occupants of the ark have left their lifeboat. The first thing Noah does is to build an altar and offer a burnt offering. God was pleased with Noah's effort. In verse 21, God promises to never again curse the ground. Some translations use doom in place of curse. And according to Spicer, the Hebrew word is more like to belittle or slight or mistreat. God relates the decision regarding the land as being in spite of humankind. God recognizes the essential nature of humankind as being evil from youth. In addition, God promises to never again destroy every living creature. The passage closes with verse 22 in a poetic form, perhaps an element used in worship. God's promise is from this point to as long as the earth exists. Worship is Noah's response to his present good fortune. His act is pleasing to God. It is clearly in the presence of God. But the response from God is not made known to Noah. Just as in our worship today, God is pleased by our authentic worship and responds in ways beyond our knowing. Within the New Covenant, Matthew 18:20 shares from the words of Jesus, "Where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I am there with them." In worship, we come face to face with God. Now we move to our second passage, reading from the New Revised Standard Version, Genesis 12:6-8. Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. At that time the Canaanites were in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there he moved on to the hill country on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and invoked the name of the Lord. The word of the Lord. Abram is called by God to leave the land of Haran, where his family had settled, and to leave his people to go into Canaan. Bible scholar Gerhard von Rad notes that Abram travels through the land to the place at Shechem, one of the oldest Canaanite cities. The text continues identifying the location as the Oak of Moreh. Earlier and probably more accurate translations use Terebinth of Moreh, which was a sacred tree. The focus of Canaanite cultic center and still important in Israelite times, with additional references in Genesis 25, Deuteronomy 11, and Joshua 24. Spicer notes that Moreh is traditionally considered to be a personal name, but the original meaning, however, was probably guiding or oracular or teaching. The Greek Septuagint translated as lofty. Similarly, the Latin Vulgate. This is a sacred space in Israel's story, and it moves into the story of Jesus as the location of his conversation with the woman at the well. The latter half of verse 6 notes that this is not a particularly suitable land for Jacob and his company, in that the land was possessed by the Canaanites. In verse 7, Abram experiences a theophany, and God speaks to him. Abram has been faithful to act on what his understanding has been about God's will for his life. Now, God tells him about the land where he is. This is the land that God will give, not to him, but to his descendants. One might expect Abram to respond with at least disappointment to not being a recipient of the land, but this was not his response. He built an altar to God. For Abram, this is a sacred space. Here God has appeared and has spoken, and God is worthy to be worshipped. This is the first altar to be built in what we call the Holy Land. The altar is erected near a place of pagan worship in a land possessed by others. Von Wright comments, it was a sign, at first silent, still non-combative, of infinite significance. After erecting the altar, Abram moves further south, to the highland of Benjamin in Judah. He encamps east of Bethel, which is modern by 10, about 10 miles north of Jerusalem, and west of Ai, which is modern Et Tel. Here, between two Canaanite settlements, he once more builds an altar and calls on the name of Yahweh. In the cult, he called on the God who is revealed with his name. Spicer reminds us this is not to be the tale of individuals or a family or a people as such. Rather, it is to be the story of a society in quest for an ideal. Abram's call, in short, marks the very beginning of the biblical process. And now for our final passage, reading from the New Revised Standard Version, Genesis 28, 10 through 22. Jacob left Beersheba and went toward Haran. He came to a certain place and stayed there for the night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones of the place, he put it under his head and lay down in that place. And he dreamed that there was a ladder set up on the earth, the top of it reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And the Lord stood beside him, and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and to your offspring. And your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And all the families of the earth shall be blessed in you and in your offspring. Know that I am with you and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. Then Jacob woke from his sleep and said, Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. And he was afraid and said, How awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. So Jacob rose early in the morning, and he took the stone that he had put under his head and set it up for a pillar, and poured oil on the top of it. He called that place Bethel, but the name of the city was Luz at the first. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, If God will be with me, and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God, and this stone which I have set up for a pillar shall be God's house, and of all that you give me, I will surely give 1/10 to you. The word of the Lord. Chapter 28 follows seamlessly from the drama of Jacob deceiving Isaac and incurring the wrath of his brother. With the help of his mother, Rebekah, he flees for a more secure life with her brother Laban in Haran. Jacob travels through the daylight hours after the sun sets. His experience provides the content of the narrative in the passage we are considering today. Now, the account as we have it comes from two sources. The Yahwistic, which is recognized by calling God by the name Yahweh, and the Elohistic, recognized by calling God by the name Elohim. While most of us do not have competence with biblical Hebrew, it is readily apparent that even in reading our translated passages, there are very distinctives within the text. Wright notes that apart from the change in the divine name, verses 16 and 17 are obviously parallel. Likewise, 19a and 22a, in the first of which Jacob recognizes the place as a house of God, and in the second of which he designates it as the place of a future house of God. One must recognize the Elohist dominant role in verses 10 through 12 and 17 through 20, with the exception of verse 19. The Yahwist version in verses 13 through 16 and verse 19. Spicer details that God communicates with Jacob in a dream. That's verse 12, as is customary for the Elohist, whereas the Yahwist speaks of God as standing beside Jacob and addressing him directly. The successive exclamations in 16 and 17 would be redundant in an account written by the same writer, but are natural enough when traced back to two separate sources. Our passage is a composite of the two sources that provides for us a memorable narrative of Jacob's night on his journey to Haran and along the journey of Israel's history. Verse 10 through 11 tells of the beginning and of the destination for Jacob's journey. The narrative indicates Jacob stopping for the night at a certain place. We can see that physical location, place, is an important part of this account. And as the narrative continues, the significance of place emerges. Verse 12 gives the account of the dream with its ladder to heaven. Later in verse 17b, Jacob would declare that the ladder reaches to the gate of heaven. Von Rudd notes this as that narrow place where, according to ancient worldview, connections or dealings between earth and the upper divine world took place. God's messengers go back and forth here continually, not bearing prayers to God, but fulfilling divine commands and supervising the earth. When we think of the ladder to heaven, however, we should not think of an actual ladder, for such a simultaneous mounting and descending of wingless divine messengers on it would not be easily conceivable. The Hebrew word sulam points to a ramp, or in any case, a kind of stair-like pavement. To understand the whole, however, one must know that in the ancient Orient, a rather general distinction was made between the earthly place of a God's appearing and his actual heavenly dwelling place. Thus, on the gigantic Babylonian temple towers, The dwelling place of the God is symbolized by the uppermost chamber, while below on earth there is a temple where the God appears. And from top to bottom, as the characteristic mark of this cultic building, there runs a long ramp. Thus, Jacob too makes a distinction in this sense. This is a house of God, that is to say, the place where God appears, which is to become a cultic center with a cultic building. And this is the gate of heaven. Behind this conception, which now dominates the narrative, we can, however, recognize a much earlier one in which the stone itself was understood as an abode of God. Verse 12 concludes the Elohist version of the vision. It was a still and mute dream, a solemn encounter for Jacob, so much so that he came to realize that he was at the entrance of the heavenly world. The Yahweh's account begins at verse 13 and considers this occasion as a theophany and a solemn address to Jacob. Verse 13 reads, "I am the Lord the God," or more precisely, "I am Yahweh the God." Now, Spicer suggests that a better translation would read, "I, Yahweh, am the God," because the description applies not to the name, but to the deeds. Here in verse 13, God stands beside Jacob and is not mute. God speaks in this Yahwistic theophany. Yahweh is regarded as the God of the fathers. The speech expresses a twofold promise as it continues through verse 14. The promise is of land and a vast blessing for Jacob's descendants. Jacob surely found a sense of relief from Yahweh's declaration in verse 15. Here, Jacob, who was fleeing in fear of his life, was assured of protection from Yahweh. Jacob's experience during the night went beyond a simple dream encounter. For him, it was profound revelation from God. The place itself took on a sacred quality as Jacob proclaims, "Surely the Lord is in this place." For him, it was no accident that this is the place where he came to rest. He recognizes with terror that he had come to the very place where the earthly realm and the heavenly realm converged. In response to his realization, Jacob set up a stone to identify this sacred place. Now, this stone was casually mentioned earlier in the passage as simply a resting place for his head. Now it becomes a memorial stone. Von Rad asserts that Jacob must have had colossal strength, for such stones, known from the entire Orient, were often nearly 7 feet high. And there are other references to Jacob's Herculean strength in chapters 29 and 32. But above all, the purpose of the narrative becomes clear in this verse. It intends to tell how Bethel, which was later so famous, came to be a cultic center, and in what way the holiness of the place first became known. There is more. It intends to explain that were the circumstances connected with the stone at Bethel, Jacob had erected it and dedicated it to God by pouring oil on it. Now, anointing as a means of separating for and dedicating to God. It's also found in Exodus 30, Leviticus 8, and Genesis 31, but it was also practiced outside of Israel. Probably later the participants in the cult anointed the stone. Certainly this was the case in the bringing of the tithe, for Amos also mentions that custom in Amos 4:4. It is characteristic indeed for all of these cult legends to relate the first occurrence of such customs in order to demonstrate their general validity. When those who came later brought the tithe, they shared somewhat in Jacob's vow. They identified themselves with him and held his promise as binding for all time. One can attribute to it, as so many pious customs, a lofty meaning. It contains here, first of all, because of its chosen purpose, a quite personal union of the individual with God and an obligation to be thankful. Such a vow proceeds from the knowledge of the weakness and fickleness of the human heart, which requires the beneficent support of such a union. God's promise in verses 13 through 15 contained a great offer. Jacob grasped the preferred hand and held it drastically. He bound himself by a threefold vow to this saving act of God. The first vow, "Then Yahweh shall be my God," reveals that the narrative wishes to be understood as Yahweh's first revelation to and call of Jacob. The second understands him as the founder of the later sanctuary. And the third as the initiator of the tithe at that place. A close look at verse 20. Jacob's vow includes bread and clothing. And Spicer indicates that these two items were regularly issued to slaves, servants, and seasonal workers, and are often listed together in business documents. The sense here is equivalent to just enough to subsist on. Spicer offers a meaningful overall perspective to this passage. To the individuals concerned, Jacob's abrupt departure was a matter of personal safety. But in the history of the patriarchs, especially as seen by the Yahwistic source, the individual is a free agent only on the surface. Fundamentally, he is part of a larger pattern over which he has no control. At this stage, Jacob's security and future are important because both bear on the continuity of the biblical process. The time has now come for the fugitive to be given a glimpse of the deeper truth. That this broader meaning of the Bethel episode was sensed very early is evident from the fact that both of the narrative sources already have this tradition. They differ mostly as to detail, but Bethel stands out either way as a spiritual milestone. Our passages have given us separate but clearly related accounts of sacred space in Genesis. As we find meaning in place with its notable personal awareness of something good beyond ourselves, we discovered sacred space not unlike these Old Testament characters. It is important for us to keep ourselves open to experience the presence of God wherever we may be. As we reflect on this passage, we might ask ourselves, do I open myself to an awareness of God's presence in worship? How has God influenced my life? Where have I experienced holy moments? In what ways can I connect with God in sacred spaces? I recall the words of a popular chorus written by Lanny Wolfe. Surely the presence of the Lord is in this place. I can feel His mighty power and His grace. I can hear the brush of angels' wings. I see glory on each face. Surely the presence of the Lord is in this place. I would like to leave you with this prayer. God of grace and glory, lead us into sacred space. Open us to an awareness of your presence. Guide us in responding appropriately to our relationship with you in the life of your church, with all of your children, and in holy stewardship of creation. In your mercy we pray. Amen.